Good afternoon, everyone. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. My name is Sinan Hatahet, and I am the Vice Director of Omran for Strategic Studies, which is a think tank, a Syrian think tank that was created 2 years ago here in Istanbul. And we are primarily concerned and concentrating on the Syrian issues. Please, if you don't hear my voice well at the back, let me know so I speak louder.
Please.
Sure. So first of all, I'd like to thank ORSAM for this opportunity. It's been a long time since I last gave a lecture in a university, and the last time I gave one, it was in a less prestigious hall, so thank you.
It's our pleasure. Thank you for accepting the offer.
So if my voice is still not loud enough, please let me know. So today I'm going to speak about the Syrian revolution, about the internal dynamics. I will concentrate more on how complicated this crisis is. And I'm not going to lie to you, I know that many of my colleagues say that it's very simple crisis, that it is as people fighting for their freedom against a totalitarian regime. And this is how it started. But over the course of time, it got more complicated. Yesterday there was the UN yearly conference, and all the P5 countries, the countries that are members of the Security Council, spoke about Syria. So Syria is not an internal issue anymore. It's not a regional issue anymore. It's an international one, where it's a proxy war which most of the international powers are fighting over in order to get the best interest. Syria, however, is not as rich as Iraq, not as rich as Libya. We don't have a lot of petrol. We have just barely enough, maybe to cover, I think, two-thirds of our internal need. So it's not about oil that there is a war in Syria now and there is interest. It's about a strategic value and the strategic geographic strategic area. It is to the east of the Mediterranean. It is a neighboring country to Israel. It shares 900 kilometers of borders with Turkey. Turkey is also a very important country in the region. I suppose you already do know that. And most importantly, it is also the bridge between Iran and the rest of the world. So this is why we see that the Iranians are extremely interested in Syria, while the Turkish government is also very interested in Syria, and Russia as well, because they have a military port in Tartus, and it's the last port in the warm waters on the Mediterranean. And of course, we also have the Americans who have their own reasons to be interested in Syria. Iraq is just next door, and with the rise of ISIS, there is no more Iraq and Syria, there is Iraq and Syria. So I'm going to start with a little bit of history. In 1963, Ba'ath Party, which was founded by Michel Aflaq, took over the government in Syria. And later on in 1970, Hafez al-Assad, who was the Minister of Defense, made a coup d'etat against his own government and took the reins of powers in between his hands. Later on, it was an eventuality after 12 years that the Syrian people would start to rise against the dictatorship of Hafez al-Assad. And of course it was confronted by brutal force and by military actions. And in 1982, the Assad regime made a massacre in Hama, killing around 40,000 people in 1 month only. We are speaking about 40,000 people in the 1980s, which is in this days numbers around 150 people. So 150,000 people in 1 month only. Of course, Hafez al-Assad took advantage of a complete media blockage No one knew what's going on in Syria. There wasn't internet, there wasn't international media present in Syria. And he also came after a series of coup d'etats in Syria. So he brought stability to the region. The Israelis liked him, so did the Americans, so did the Russians. So no one did actually anything in order to stop him. After the 1982 massacre in Hama, most of the Syrian people grew afraid, especially when we learned that around 1 million people at that time fled out of the country to neighboring, not only to neighboring countries, but there was a lot of them in Europe, a lot of them in the United States and the Gulf countries. My father actually was one of the people who left the country in the 1980s. In 2000, Hafez al-Assad died, and his son took over after him. So we are speaking here about about a republic which is supposedly a democratic one. And here we see the manifestation of how false this reality is, or how false this pretension is. Because Bashar al-Assad is the son of Hafez al-Assad. He has no other attributes other than being his son. But he took over the power by the blessing of the Ba'ath party and ruled since then. So we are speaking about the first maybe monarchy, republican monarchy in the history of the world. Well, besides of course North of Korea. But this is how we compare. We compare to North of Korea. In 2011, change got to Arab countries. We all know the story of the Arab Spring, how it started in Tunisia, then it propagated to Egypt, Libya, Syria, and Yemen. So how did Bashar al-Assad dealt with this problem? He shows a complete different action, like we're going to see next. But before going there, let me give you some statistics, because unfortunately at this point, when a lot of people speak about Syria, they speak about statistics. And if my memory serves me right, Joseph Stalin said once that if you kill one person, it's a big problem. But if you kill tens of thousands, it's just statistics. So this is exactly what's happening in Syria. We're speaking about more than 300,000 people killed, civilians, out of a population of 22 million only. We are speaking about around 800,000 injured civilians. We are speaking about 4 out of 5 Syrians who are under the poverty line. And 30% of the Syrian people are struggling to find food to put on their table, on their daily table. They don't know if they go out in the morning, they will be able to be back with food to feed their children. The cost of the Syrian crisis is estimated at $202 billion. This gives you an idea about the destruction that the Syrian army has caused to the country. 3 million people have lost their jobs. 4 million are refugees in neighboring countries. This number is not true anymore because we've seen the last, waves of refugees this summer, so it hasn't been updated since then. We are speaking about at least 7 internally displaced people within the country itself. So we are at the total, there's around an estimation of 12 million people who left their homes in Syria. That's more than half of the Syrian population. 12 million out of 22 million. So imagine the problem or the crisis that has been created by the Syrian war. We are speaking of the biggest crisis since the end of the Second World War. So now I'm going to speak a little bit more about the revolution, how it started. This is a presentation that translates a paper that I wrote for SETA. You can look it up, but it's in Arabic, unfortunately, but if you have the time, maybe find someone to translate it to you, we'll find more details. But I'm going to skim through it. So, as we see it, the Syrian revolution, or war if you'd like to, went through 5 stages. The first one is the peaceful protest stage. Then there is the military confrontation stage. The introduction of transnational groups, war on terrorism, and finally, this is very recent. I cannot actually say for sure that this is a full phase, but let's describe it as such: the Russian intervention that is, date by the start of this month. So, let's speak a little bit more about phase 1, the peaceful protest. So it all started in 15 of March 2011 in Damascus. There was calls for demonstration near Al-Umayyad Mosque to denounce the lack of liberty and the oppression of the Syrian regime. It followed then by another wave of protests on the 18th of March in Dar'a, and in Douma, and in Tartus, and in Banias, and all these cities are at the heart of the country. We are not speaking about small cities that have only 10,000 of inhabitants. We are speaking about cities that have at least 500,000 of inhabitants. Later on, in June 2011, defectors from the Syrian army created the Free Syrian Army. So this is a very important event, because since from March to June, these 3 months, the regime has spun out of control. He sent his troops, security apparatus, policemen, in order to repress and oppress the manifestation and protests. They have killed hundreds of people, took thousands to jail, and there was a lot of violence committed by the regime against the Syrian people. So in this case, it was very natural to see that officers from the Syrian army defect from it, because they were put in this confrontation and they was witness themselves in front of their own, people. They kept taking orders to shoot at them, taking orders to put them to jail. And they know that it was the right cause they were protesting for. They're not terrorists, as the regime has started to say since day 1. So a lot of them defected, and they decided to create a brigade or a small army called the Free Syrian Army, with the goal of protecting civilians. It wasn't at this stage, its objective at this stage wasn't to engage military actions against the regime, but it was to protect civilians. If my voice is not here, please let me know, and if I speak too fast, also let me know. Everything is all right? Okay. So this date is very important. In June 2011, Riyad al-Assad, his name, he's a colonel from the army who defected and created with a number of his colleagues the Free Syrian armies. Their headquarters was in Syria, but they used to, to speak to media from Antakya, from Turkey. Turkey was actually the first place to host some of the Free Syrian Army representative, not fighters. In August 2011, another important event happened. The Syrian National Council has been created to represent the political aspiration of the Syrian people. So here we are speaking about politicians who were partially out of the country. Some of them were in Syria and left, and created this council in order to give a political voice for the Syrian revolution, to represent the Syrian people in international in international, conferences to speak on their behalf and to fight for their rights. And to be honest with you, at the beginning it wasn't very clear, is it something that the revolution definitely needs or not? But at a certain point they wanted to imitate what the Libyans did. The Libyans have created during the revolution what they call the Libyan Transitional Council. So the Syrian National Council was an imitation of this model with the same objective of representing the Syrian revolution. Later on, and this is a very important date, in the 27th of September, which is 6 months after the start of the revolution, the Free Syrian Army took the decision to engage the Syrian regime army. It was the first confrontation between them. And this was at a city called Arrestan. And Arrestan is a city where around half of their sons go to the military. So a lot of the defectors from the Syrian army are originally from Rastan. And when they defected, they went to their own hometown in order to protect themselves there. So what the regime did, he sent his army to Rastan in order to take it over. So before it arrives to Rastan, these defectors decided to confront it out of the city, so they protect civilians from shelling and from the imitation of Hama massacre. What happened? They did actually confronted them. Of course, the Syrian army was much more powerful than the FSA, and they won the battle and killed a number of the Syrian defectors. But of course, it wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of the confrontation, as we will see later on. So, after around 9 months of constant killing, constant jailing, and a lot of abuse in human rights, the UN Security Council assemble themselves, they meet in order to discuss Syria. And Qatar has asked France at this point to present a resolution against Bashar al-Assad regime in the UN, to which, of course, as you may already know, Russia and China both vetoed against it. And it was a green light to a certain degree for the Syrian regime and Bashar al-Assad to keep on killing civilians and to keep on their military actions against the Syrian people. What happened after that is that in the same month, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and also with the support of Turkey, who is not a member of the Arab League but a friend of the Arab League, and sometimes they do attend Arab League meetings, they have urged the Arab countries to suspend Syria membership from the Arab League. So the Arab League is also, even though it's not as important as the UN, but it's very symbolic because it is a council that gather all the Arab states. Around 22 states are represented in the Arab League. And it is also part of the UN, and most of the time resolutions that are related to Arab countries go through the Arab League and to the UN Security Council. So what happened in the same month, that all the Arab countries has voted to suspend Syria. Only 3 countries didn't vote, but they didn't object either, which is Algeria, Iraq, and Lebanon. Iraq and Lebanon, of course, because they are under the influence of Iran. And Algeria, you all know Bouteflika. He's old. How old is he, do you think? I think he's over 80. And anyway, he is in the same position of Bashar al-Assad. He feared a revolution, a popular revolution against him. So in the same case, Algeria also didn't vote for it. Anyway, At the end, Syria was suspended out of the Arab League, and it was a positive step in order to put pressure on the UN and the Security Council, and they appointed Kofi Annan. Kofi Annan was the joint Arab League and UN envoy to Syria. His job was to meet with the Syrian government, with Bashar al-Assad regime, and also with opposition, and to find a solution or an end to this turmoil. Of course, he didn't succeed, and later on he also resigned, but he came up with what we call the 6 planned points, which consisted of ceasefire, the retrieval of all military actions from cities, the liberation of political prisoners, also the access of media, international media to the country, etc. So this is mostly it, but I'm not going to bore you with it. Anyway, this phase ended in February 2012 when the Syrian army took over, made an assault on Baba Amr. Baba Amr is a small village which is next to Homs, and eventually when Homs grew bigger, turned into a neighborhood within Homs itself. Homs has a very strategic importance in Syria. Not only it was one of the first cities that participated in the revolution, but it's also in a center of the country, and it is in a place where you can actually, if you can preserve the unity of the country, of Syria. So when the army stormed over Baba Amr, it was the first military action with bombardment, with tanks, with helicopters against a civilian neighborhood. At this point, it was the end of the peaceful protest phase and the start of the military confrontation. The people who were at the heart of the civilian movement, who were peaceful, who were non-violent, lose, voice. They are confronting every day a brutalist, heartless regime. So the people who supported military actions took over, and they were more, in control within the revolutionary scenery. And before that, so what happened since this date is that the Free Syrian Army and the military groups took control of the Syrian revolution. During this phase, Jabhat al-Nusra was created. It was not announced in the beginning, but we know that it was created around January 2012. So just before Baba Amr actually, but it wasn't active. Jabhat al-Nusra is a very important faction of the Syrian revolution because they are aligned, they swear allegiance to Al-Qaeda. So this was actually a game changer in Syria because the regime since day one was always accusing the Syrian revolution of being terrorists, of being, Islamic forces against a circular one. So when Jabhat al-Nusra was announced and got more active on the ground, and it is affiliated to Al-Qaeda, this gave some reason to the regime. And some people started to believe it, that it's actually terrorists fighting the regime. Even though Jabhat al-Nusra till our day is a very small faction in comparison with the rest of the Syrian revolutionary scenery. Just a month after, and around the same date in Baba Amr, just a couple of weeks after, the massacre of Hula occurred. Though this is not, the regime hasn't committed one massacre in Syria only. The regime committed hundreds of massacres, but this one has a very high importance because it was made during the presence of UN convoy in Syria. The UN have sent earlier, as I told you, with Kofi Annan, a numbers of investigators in order to investigate the regime actions against civilians, the regime breach of human rights. So it occurred during their presence in Damascus, and when they went to Hula, when they got the news that the massacre occurred, they arrived 2 days later. They were capable of finding bodies, of taking notes, of interviewing the witnesses, and this pushed the Western countries, France, UK, Germany, and most of the European countries and United States to take a very strong stand against Bashar al-Assad regime, and they decided to withdraw their ambassadors from Damascus and to cut all the diplomatic relationship with Bashar al-Assad regime. And from then, a lot of people were hopeful that the international community will play a positive role in ending this never-ending massacres of the Syrian regime. Of course, we will see that this is not true and has been a false, let's say, hope in the international community. And the 13th of June, just after the resignation of Kofi Annan, both the United States and Russia meet in Geneva, and they agree on what we call and will be still very valid until our day is valid, the Geneva Communique for Peace in Syria. This Geneva Communique is based on the 6-point plans of Kofi Annan, and it presents a number of issues on which the Syrian war or crisis should end. And it is concentrating on the helping the Syrian people transit to democracy. Later on the there's a small mistake here, but later on in November 2012, the Syrian National Coalition, and not National Council, was created in Doha, and it was a larger representative group of the Syrian people, larger than this SNC, which is this National Council. It regrouped opposition from across ideologies in Syria, from Muslim Brotherhood and Salafis at the right till Marxists on the left. All of them are represented in a certain degree in the Syrian National Coalition. And the first president of the Syrian National Council was a known Damascene Imam, who is a politician as well, called Mu'adh al-Khatib, and he was a very well-respected figure in Syria, respected both by opposition and also some of the loyalists in Syria. He tried through his 6 months of presidency to make a change and to push the international community to intervene in a more pragmatic way in Syria, but unfortunately he failed. Now to this very other important event within the same phase, which is the 19th of July 2013, Hezbollah has officially started its intervention in Syria in a battle in Qusayr city, just next to Homs. And before then, there was report that Hezbollah was participating, was helping the Syrian army, but it wasn't announced. But at this date in particular, even Hassan Nasrallah himself go up on TV and he announced the participation of the Hezbollah fighters in Syria. We speak, on media, we speak a lot about Al-Qaeda intervention in Syria through Jabhat al-Nusra and later on ISIS. But very few people speak about Hezbollah. Hezbollah is not a Syrian group. It is a Lebanese group. It is a foreign militia which is participating in an internal issues. This is foreign intervention as well, especially if we take into consideration that Hezbollah is funded and supported directly by Iran and Tehran. So this is a date that is very important because it was at a time where the regime was actually losing a lot of territory, lost most of its battles with the Syrian army, and Hezbollah, when he intervened, he stopped this hemorrhage. Later on, in 21. In the summer of 2013, PYD, which is the Syrian branch of PKK, has announced a self-governed Rojava established area in north of Syria. So this was also the first period in which the Kurdish separatist forces in Syria announced their active participation in this war. Of course, the PYD was capable of making such announcements with the cooperation and coordination with the Syrian regime. It's the Syrian regime who understood what they wanted, and give it to them in exchange of forming an alliance against certain common enemies. So whenever the FSA, for example, is near the Kurdish areas, the Kurdish usually attack them. This happened just a week before, actually, in Aleppo. There is a small Kurdish power in northern of the city, and it is just adjacent to a route that is important for the Syrian revolutionary forces in the city in order to get, weapons, to get also food. The Kurdish forces actually attacked the FSA forces and helped the regime to get in and out of the city. So now, this is the last event of this phase, and it announced the start of the next phase, the phase number 3, which is the 21st of August 2013. And this is a black day in Syrian recent history. It is the date in which the Syrian army has used chemical weapons against civilians in eastern Ghouta. Eastern Ghouta is just a neighboring, area to Damascus. In the dawn of this day, at 5 o'clock, they launched sarin gas against the Syrian civilians in these areas, leaving around 1,400 civilians killed in this area. This was a very important also event because just a year before, Obama has made a clear statement saying that the use of chemical weapons against civilians in Syria is a red line, and if the regime actually does use chemical weapons against civilians, that the United States will intervene in Syria and stop the war. So what happened? What happened and was the commencement of the phase 3, it is that the Russians and the Americans found a deal. This deal is that the Syrian government hand over its chemical arsenal to the international community in exchange of punity. Of course, I say punity, they haven't said that, but this is exactly how the regime understood it. Because the regime, when he saw that he can get away from using chemical weapons against civilians, the last time there was chemical weapons used against civilians was in World War II. And it wasn't even in cities, it was in concentration camps. It was in World War II, it was Germany against Jews. The first time after was Bashar al-Assad. So he actually thought himself that this is a green light, I should continue. Everything else besides using chemical weapons is alright. Aviation, barrel bombs, wiping complete cities to the earth. That's all right, and this is exactly what happened. And this is why we've seen also transnational groups prosper in Syria. Because wherever there is a huge amount of injustice, it is very normal, it is natural to see desperation. And this desperation usually conclude to groups like Qaeda, like ISIS, like ISIL, to be created. Because out of desperation, there's desperate measure as well. Anyway, in 21st of November 2013, the Islamic Front was created. And the Islamic Front is a very important faction of the Syrian revolution at that time. Now it doesn't exist anymore, because it actually regrouped all the Islamic forces who are not Al-Qaeda and ISIL to form a unique front. And this was very important because ISIS at this point was taking over the eastern part and northern part of the country. They were the only one who were speaking in an Islamic, narrative, and the Islamic Front, who are Syrians and national, who are very, I wouldn't say democratic, but they are, acceptable, they accept democracy. They stopped this hemorrhage. They said, no, ISIS doesn't represent Islam in Syria. We represent Islam in Syria. We fight as Muslims. So this front was very important in order to stop the expansion of ISIS within the Syrian people. And this concluded, of course, just 2 months ago, to the first battle between ISIS and the Syrian revolutionary forces. And this was in Idlib and Aleppo. The Islamic Front, as well as other groups from the FSA, launched a war against ISIS, and they kicked them out of Idlib, of Aleppo, and ISIS got concentrated on Raqqa only. And later on we see that they were capable of going more to the east. But this is very important as well, because the Syrian regime has always said that it is the only force on the ground fighting ISIS. But this is not true, because as we will see, in all battles against ISIS in Syria, the regime has never engaged them first. It happens only twice. It happens at an airport near Raqqa called Tabaqa, and another time in Tadmor in Palmyra city. And in both occasions, it was ISIS who engaged the regime and not the regime. However, the only forces that fought ISIS in Syria were the Syrian revolutionary forces, and later on the PYD when they got attacked in Kobani. So, as you see, the Syrian regime, as I told you, has handed over his chemical weapons. A part of the deal was between the Russians and the Americans that the Russians will push Bashar al-Assad to attend a conference in Geneva based on Geneva communique, the one that I explained to you in the second phase, in order to make negotiations with the Syrian revolutionary forces. So at this point in Geneva, in Montreux, to be more exact, it started in Montreux. A meeting was held under the supervision of the United Nations and under the supervision also of Lakhdar al-Ibrahimi, who was the special envoy at this point, between the Syrian regime and the Syrian National Coalition. It lasted for 1 month only, over 2 periods of times, and of course it led to nothing, because Bashar al-Assad has made no concessions whatsoever, didn't want to apply the Geneva Convention communique, and didn't want actually to go there in the first place. And the regime was hopeful that the Syrian opposition were going to boycott the negotiation, but when they actually came, he had no plan whatsoever, rather than saying no to everything, and eventually it stopped. It failed. Nothing happened. And at the same time, just so the regime show also the international community that is capable of brokering deals in Syria. He started a new trend. The regime started to encircle, to surround small groups within Syria and to cut them off food, water, electricity and everything for long periods of time, to besiege them for 6 months, for a year and so, in order to break their wills. And just at the end, he would make a ceasefire deal with them. And this is important because it shows how the regime changed its strategy. Instead of engaging in battles in which most of it lost at the end, he started to use barrel bombs and aviation and use, as I told you, what was the word? It used besieging civilian areas in order to break the will. So the other importance and implication of this ceasefires, it was a clear message to the international community that I don't need to speak with the Syrian opposition in order to find a deal in Syria. I can speak with the groups directly on the ground. And this was very damaging because it showed that actually the political opposition that lived abroad were not completely on the same page with these military revolutionary groups on the ground. There's a cleavage between them. And this cleavage, since this date and later on, will just get deeper and wider. And today we see most of the people who know about Syria, they will say there is a political opposition and a military opposition. Do not waste your time with political opposition because they are not on the ground, but speak with military opposition. Of course, both of them are important. The military and the political complete themselves. So when you break them down and you divide them, this is actually easier to negotiate with them. So this is exactly what the Syrian regime did. Of course, the Syrian regime is not as sophisticated as that, but it was very well helped by the Russians and the Iranians, who are very well experienced in this way of this kind of of wars. We've seen what Russia has did in Chechnya before. We see what Iran has did in Iraq before. This is not the first time they got engaged in such a war. So that's another event. It's an event that didn't happen in Syria. It happened in Iraq. But as I told you before, there is no more Iraq and Syria. Now there is Iraq and Syria. They are the same geographical problem. They have the same ISIS, the same problem and crisis. And in the 4th of June 2014, ISIS took over Mosul in Iraq. And this was the first major city they took control in this area. They took control of Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor before, but they are, small cities, prefecturias in Damascus, in Syria. They do not represent a big importance in this area. But Mosul, however, is the second biggest city in Iraq. And it means that they finally have a capital worthy of their, ambitions. And just after that, less than a month after, al-Baghdadi announced himself as the Muslim Caliphate, al-Khalifa al-Islamiyya, and he announced the creation of the Islamic State. It's not ISIS anymore, it's the Islamic State. And I am the Caliphate. And every Muslim had the obligation to swear allegiance to me, because this is how the dogma and how their ideology is, and actually in most of the Muslim ideology is, whenever there's a caliphate, you need to swear allegiance to it. So now, al-Baghdadi has complete control of what he thinks is the Muslim jihadi scenery. He is the caliphate, everyone should listen to him, and this creates a huge problem to everyone, not only to the Syrian people and the Iraqi people, but most importantly to the Western countries, to the United States, to Europe, to Russia, because they are going to attack their own interests in Iraq. And this is why at the 10th of September, Obama has announced the creation of the international coalition against ISIS. An international coalition that we're going to start bombing ISIS in Syria and in Iraq, but in a much more stronger way in Iraq than in Syria, because Iraq is much more important in their eyes in terms of oil and richness, and they will push a lot of them to Syria later on. So this actually marked the end of the third phase. And the start of the fourth phase, which is war on terrorism. Now, no one speaks about Bashar al-Assad as it used to be before. It's always comes in second or third. Always the first thing they speak about is war on terrorism. Since then, whether it is Obama, or it is Putin, or it is Holland, or even Saudi King Salman, and before him King Abdullah, they always speak about fighting ISIS, fighting terrorism. This is now the general guideline. This is what dictates the situation in Syria and in Iraq. So the first event in this phase was the attack of ISIS on Kobani in September 2014. ISIS was at its most stronger position at this time. They were feeling confident. They took over a large areas in Iraq and Syria, and they closed down on Kobani. They took most of the villages around it, and they were actually maybe 2 days away from taking the city. And this is when actually the international community has played a major role in stopping ISIS from taking the cities. It bombarded heavily the ISIS forces around it, and it also dropped weapons to the fighters there. This is a very important event because it's an event that's not only going to have an impact on the ISIS in Syria. It will also have an impact on the Syrian revolutionary forces who weren't present at this battle. They will also have an impact on Turkey, on the PKK, and also in the PYD, and also in Barazani. Everyone in this area was actually, thank you very much, was impacted by this war, by this battle. What Turkey and Barazani, and so Barazani, you all know who he is. Barazani is the president of the KRG, Kurdish regional government, sorry, in Iraq, who is, as you all know, close ally of Ankara. They didn't want the PYD to take advantage of this battle. So what they tried to do is to pressure the PYD to accept Peshmerga forces to enter Kobani and to participate in this battle. So when the ISIS will be defeated, it's not only PYD who will take advantage, but also Peshmerga, who are competitor of PYD in Syria and also in the whole region. Unfortunately, what they didn't succeed, because the United States has a different idea. The United States grew to like PYD and grew to like PKK. Why? Because not only they are a minority, which is easy to control, especially in Syria, but they are also Marxist, so they are not religious, they are not Islamic, and most importantly, they can also put pressure on the Turkish government. And this is very important for them, especially in Syria, because the Turkish government has been always supporting other than their plans. The Americans weren't very fond of the support of Turkey to the FSA. The Americans wanted this war to end, whereas Turkey, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia has supported the Free Syrian Army and also the Islamic Front, which is considered, just at the border edge of being terrorist groups by the United States, has been supported by them. So this was also an occasion for them to use the PYD and the PKK at this stage to put pressure on Turkey. And this pressure, as we will see, will pay off eventually, because Turkey will finally participate in this international coalition against ISIS, even though it refused to participate into the beginning. However, even though the whole scene doesn't look very good and very advantageous for the Syrian opposition, a new tendency has created. We are seeing and witnessing more regional and geographical military coalitions. Before, it was more concentrated on ideology. We see Islamic forces forming coalitions. We see also national groups forming coalitions. These groups were not necessarily in the same place, but they were forming these coalitions and coordination based on ideology. But at this stage, the groups grew more mature. So instead of doing it on ideological, background, they started to do it on geographical proximity. So we see more coalitions created in Aleppo, more coalitions created in Dar'a, and this was very effective in the war against the regime. And as we will later on see, will have a great influence on the war. On 19th of February, the Turkish government and the Americans has also agreed to start a train and equip program for Syrian fighters against ISIS. We will see that this train and equip program is the most thing that the American will do in Syria. But unfortunately, this program so far has failed. They have only trained 70 people. 70 people is not even enough to secure a small neighborhood in Aleppo. So how to start a fight against ISIS is impossible. But anyway, this was the start of it. Maybe some days in the future we will see more punch into it. We will see more people trained and more equipment delivered to them, but this is not the case for the time being. Anyway, as I told you, this regional and geographical military coalitions has led also to greater military maneuver. And in the 28th of March, the Jaish al-Fatah, which is a coalition of revolutionary forces in Idlib and northern of Aleppo, has liberated the whole Idlib province. So Idlib is very important, especially for you in Turkey, because it's a neighboring province to Turkey. It's just the next door. It's just to the south. So they have completely liberated it from the regime. And the same also happened in the south, where they took large areas against the regime. Now, this is also an event that you might think is not directly, related to the Syrian revolution, to the Syrian crisis, but it would have a huge impact, which is which happens on the 14th of July 2015, when Tehran and the P5 country has reached a deal on nuclear weapon. This gave Tehran a larger margin of maneuver in Syria and in the whole region. Now they are under the oppression that they can be, I wouldn't say allies, but in good terms with the United States. So the United States will not actually go in war against Iran in this region anymore. They are not going to jeopardize this very important deal with Tehran, as they were capable of before. So Tehran now feel more comfortable. They are intervening in a much more fiercer way in Syria, in Yemen, in Iraq. They feel that they are not challenged because they don't think that the GCC countries can actually go against them. They are not going to engage Turkey, but they know that Turkey is not going to engage them either. So they are in a very comfortable place. So now we come to the 17th of August, which is a very recent date. The UN Security Council has approved the de Mistura plan, which is a plan consisted of negotiations between small groups, and not opposition and regime, but between regime and small groups. So even more fragmentation of the Syrian opposition, which is very bad for them, of course. And the Mistura, which is the latest envoy to the Syria, has started its work. And the latest event, to which I'm going to start to end this explanation and to onto something new, is when the Russians has increased their intervention and support to the Syrian regime in the 7th of when it started on the 7th of September, just less than 3 weeks ago, to which Bashar al-Assad now feels even more comfortable. He doesn't only enjoy the support of Iran, but it also enjoys the presence, the physical presence of the Russian military in Syria. So now let's look a little bit more on the map. I'm going to stand up because the seat is too comfortable, I might sleep. So here is the Syria. Just before the revolution, of course, it was only one state. But now, look how fragmented this geography is. The regime here in orange controlled only, only 16% of this country. Whereas the Free Syrian Army or the Revolutionary Army control around 12% here, especially in Idlib and around Aleppo, and in parts around Damascus and Dar'a, and some parts in the south. The third party that occupies also a large area of Syria is the YPG, which is the army of PYD, are in the north. And as you see, most of the Turkish and Syrian borders are within the hand of the PYD, the Syrian branch of PKK. So you will understand why also the Turkish government is very wary of this changes in Syria, and this is why it also is a very important part of their foreign policy. And at the end, of course, we have ISIS, which is in all over this area, control around 42% of the country, but it's not the most important 42% because less than 5% of the Syrian population live here. But however, they do have access to Iraq, and they control some of the oil, fields in here. I told you it's not very much. They do not produce a lot, but it's good, still good business for ISIS, especially when we know that they only are responsible for 5% of the Syrian population. So how does that translate on the ground? What is the state now of the Syrian regime? Socially, the Syrian regime is still undergoing a lot of defections from the Syrian army. They are not defecting in order to join the revolution, they are defecting in order to join local militias. So it means that not only the Syrian opposition is fragmented, which is unfortunate, but also the Syrian loyalist forces are fragmented. We are not speaking about a state or a whole nation anymore. We are speaking about everyone, getting more reserved and protective of itself, and and taking care only of the city. So this is the exact same thing that's happening with the regime. They are leaving the Syrian army and they are joining local militias in order to protect their cities. They are still loyal to the regime, but they are not ready, or they are not willing to fight as they used to do before all over the country. They will fight only in their cities in order to protect their neighborhood. So we are seeing a larger popularization of local militias. These local militias and local warlords are much more in power and much more popular now than they used to be before. Bashar al-Assad is not as popular even within loyalists as he used to be before. He's losing a lot of momentum. Of course, these groups always, as well, who are Syrians at the end, are also growing irritated of Hezbollah and Iran intervention in Syria. At the end, the loyalist forces in Syria, most of them are secular. They are not Islamic. And Hezbollah and Iran are very Islamic. They are Shias, granted, but they are very Islamic. So they see people who are intervening, they are looking on them, they feel that they are unappreciated and that they are under control of foreigners, which is something that they cannot accept, especially that Hezbollah for a long time was actually trained in Syria before. So how can someone that I trained myself is now my commander? So there is irritation from this Iran and Hezbollah intervention. And on the contrary, and on the other hand, there is relief now that the Russians are intervening. The Russians are secular. The Russians are people that always supported us, that are always with us. They gave us, not only they gave us weapons, but also when I was younger, I went and studied there. This is how they think. So they feel comfortable. They feel that the Russians are here to rescue them, to help them. Of course, this also translates also in sectarian tensions within loyalist groups as well, because there is not only Alawites and Sunnis and Shia in Syria. And by the way, Shias are less than 1% in Syria, but Sunnis are around 70%, Alawi are around 10%, and there is small sects then. There is Durzis, there is Ismailites, and the Durzi, for example, and Ismailites, who were, standing just in the middle. They didn't want to go with the opposition, and they didn't want also to involve themselves a lot with the regime. Now also grew tired of the regime because they felt that they were used by the regime under the pretext of protecting minorities. So we've seen, especially in Druze areas, there is movement, there is tension. They do not like to be controlled by Alawites, who are mostly in the army and the security apparatus. And of course, this translates in a very limited enrollment capacity. The Syrian army is not capable of enrolling new people in the army as it used to be before. Now, a lot of youth are fleeing out of the country. You've seen the last wave of refugees. Not all of them are women and children. Actually, most of them are young people from age of 18 to age of 40, fleeing out of the country because they do not want to carry weapons, neither with the opposition or with the regime. But the only difference between the opposition and the regime in this case, that the opposition, if you don't carry weapons with them, they do not make you to take it. However, the regime will take you, because if you don't, they will put you in jail. On the economic side, the Syrian pound is still collapsing. It is now at 1/10 of its value before the Syrian revolution. There is a huge dependency on ISIS and PYD oil, and this is where the whole irony is. So ISIS and PYD supposedly are enemy states. However, that does not stop the regime from buying their oil. This shows you how the economy is completely in parallel to the politics in Syria. And it's not only in Syria, I think it's all over the place. Military, as I told you, there is territory regression in the north and the east, and there is also military concentration in what they call the useful Syria. So if I go back, this is what they call the useful Syria. The Syria that they actually control. So there is military concentration in here, which is actually, you can see it as regression, but it also might be something good for them, because that means they do not have to distribute all their forces all over the country, especially that they are they don't have this enrollment capacity as they used to do before. Internationally, now they have the Russians in position of force with them. However, Iran is losing monopoly in Syria. Before the Russian intervention, Iran was complete control of the Syrian regime and also the state. Now we are seeing more and more Russian intervention on the dependence of Iran. And there is actually, and this is very bad news for the opposition, there is a lot of attempts to naturalize the Syrian diplomatic relationship between Syria and some of the Arab countries and European states. We've seen what Angela Merkel said the other day. She said that it is all right to have Bashar al-Assad in a transitional period, which is actually a complete regression from their own position before, where you used to say that Bashar al-Assad needs to leave before the transitional period. So what is the state of the revolutionary forces? Socially, there's a huge problem. They have multiple juridical systems. So that means that actually you don't have a way to govern, because the essence of governing is a juridical system, a unique one. So this is a problem that the Syrian revolutionaries are facing. However, on the other hand, there is something very positive. We are seeing more and more influence and presence from local councils in Syria, in the liberated area. Local councils is one of the latest, forms of civilian governance in Syria. It is like like the Baladiya here in Turkey. So these groups are getting more influence. They are more on the ground, and this gives a possibility for civilians to participate in ruling, which is something, of course, they do not have in regime-held areas. However, we see that there is still a lack of coordination between civilians and military, especially in law enforcement. Most of the law enforcement is under the hand of the military. This is, of course, something that is understandable in the situation where there is a war and there's a lot of war criminals around. And the other problem, which is also typical in wartime, which is lack of separation between authorities. We have the executional, the juridical, and also the representational, authority. Sometimes all in one person, which is completely, destructive, as we all know. On the economic side, there is increasing dependency on humanitarian assistance. And this is why there should be change in humanitarian assistance in Syria. Instead of delivering food or food baskets, it should be more and more, empowerment for small and micro projects in order to help the Syrian people grow their own economy. There is lack of transparency and accountability. So this means that it's also difficult to prove yourself worthy of getting assistance from the international community. This is something that actually we work on our group, in our center, to help the Syrian civilian groups to learn how to be more transparent and to have a better accountability. And of course, they are also depending on volatile source of oil. So and oil in this area is very important for the economic life. You cannot have electricity, you cannot run hospitals without it. So they buy from the black market. If there is no oil in the black market, hospitals stops, cars stops, everything stops. So this is also a very huge problem for the revolutionary forces. As in military aspect, it's much more better. They have gained a lot of territory in Idlib and Dar'a. They have maintained the resistance around Damascus, which is very difficult because they are surrounded by the regime. And they cause huge losses in Hezbollah forces in direct confrontation, especially around Zabadani and areas in Qalamun. And most importantly, they have stopped the expansion of ISIS in the north of Aleppo. This is very important because if ISIS is capable actually of taking north of Aleppo, that would mean that they will have no connection with Turkey anymore. And geographical connection with Turkey is very important for military resistant groups in Syria, because this is from where they got most of their assistance. Internationally, Turkey is still looking for a local partner to create a buffer zone in the north, because Turkey, as I'm going to show you here in this area, especially here, they are trying to convince the international community to create a buffer zone here. This buffer zone is to stop ISIS, of course, to push them out of the borders, but also the other reason, which is to prevent the Kurdish forces in Afrin and in Kobani to join there. So they will actually take all of the borders with Turkey. So this buffer zone is very important. However, the Turkish government do not want to engage the Turkish army. They do not want them to get in. So how would they achieve that? Is through Syrian actors, through Syrian military groups. So they are still looking for Syrian groups, especially from here, to come and fill this area. And this is not something easy to convince the Syrian groups with, because the Syrian groups are trying to fight the regime here. So if they feel that if they go and fill this area, the regime will be more comfortable around Aleppo. So this is something that actually what the Syrian opposition is asking for is something more integral. Tell us what is the next step. Okay, we are ready to fill this area, but what are you going to give us in return? Are you going to give us more weapons? Are you going to give us guarantees that the regime is not going to take Aleppo back? So this is a discussion that is ongoing. The financial support from the GCC countries, Qatar and Saudi Arabia, is still ongoing. However, they do have a problem, which is with the United States. The United States is unwilling to shape an end game in Syria. They do not want it to end yet. For the time being, they are not pressured. The priority is ISIS. Bashar al-Assad is way down. It doesn't matter what Obama said yesterday in his speech. We all know that at the end, he wants one thing in Syria only at the time being, which is ending ISIS. What about the YPG and PYD? So the PYD in Syria have a huge popular support in Hasaka and Kobani. In this area, the Kurdish from this area, like PYD, they think that they have succeeded protecting them from ISIS. They do not necessarily share the same ideology, but they think that they are here to protect them. So this is very important. They support them. They don't only stomach them, no, they support them. This is, however, different in Afrin. In Afrin, which is the region here, if you see it here, in Afrin, this is a region that has never been in fight against ISIS, or against the regime, or against Jabhat al-Nusra. So they never has faced this fear, this threat. And they are always been socially more integrated in the Syrian, society. So they are much more resistant to the PYD rather than in Hasaka and in Kobani. So we see actually there have been a popular vote last month in Afrin, and the PYD had to force the results of the polls in order to win, because the population has voted against PYD in this area. However, of course, the war launched by the Turkish government on PKK has also had an impact on their support in Turkey, in the Kurdish society in Turkey. I wouldn't say that they have completely abandoned them, but they don't have the same support they used to have before. And of course, they still have to manage the competition with Barzani, because Barzani may not have enough influence on Kurdish people here in Turkey. However, he has a lot of influence on Syrian Kurdish people. So they are always trying to manage this competition. Whenever they see Barzani, gaining a lot of influence, they find a way to stop him, to find a way to bother him. Even in Iraq itself, actually. Economy, they have a thriving oil trade, and unfortunately, they also have the support of the international community. The international community that think that PYD is a very viable partner in the war against ISIS. Military, they have gained indeed a lot of territory against ISIS. They have liberated Kobani. They have been able also to kick out ISIS from Tal Abyad. Tal Abyad, what is it? Aqshali, I think. Aqshali. So all of that is considered something positive for them. International, as I told you, they are also, even though Turkey has announced war only against PKK and has only targeted PKK, they know that eventually Turkey might attack them as well. So they are also running this risk. As for ISIS, they are facing a competition with Nusra. Nusra, as I told you, is a Qaeda affiliate. and even a certain time part of ISIS. So now they don't have this monopole over the jihadi scenery as before, especially since they lost a lot of power over the last year. So now Nusra, on the other hand, is being more pragmatic. It knows how to deal with the local populations. So they are facing competition with them. Economic-wise, they have a much more difficulty producing oil than before, because the international coalition has targeted a lot of their oil production units. Military, they have lost a lot of territory in the north, and however they have been expanding in the Syrian desert, as we see in here. This area wasn't in ISIS' hands a year ago. They have succeeded taking it over right now, but it's in the desert. Even though it doesn't still have a certain value, because it is a very strategic road that actually links the west to the east. Last point, and this is something that wasn't true a year before. Now all regional powers are engaged in the war against ISIS. The Kurdish are, the KRG is, the Kurdish PYD is, the Syrian Revolutionary Forces, Qataris, Saudis, Emiratis, Egyptians, and even the Turkish government, who in the beginning didn't participate, are now participating. There is no regional power now in this area that is not engaging ISIS anymore. So this is, I think that I'm running off of time. I have 10 minutes left only.
Yeah, but we can extend 5 or 10 minutes. No
okay,
problem.
sure. So I'm going to go through some of some infographs that we made for this occasion. So let's see the impact of the Syrian crisis, because in Syria it's not only about, as I told you in the beginning, it's more than an internal problem. It's even more than a regional problem. It's now an international problem, an international crisis. So let's see the impact of the Syrian crisis on the regional order. First of all, we have the nuclear deal. As you see, as I told you, the nuclear deal have clear consequences. The first one is that the regional powers now are going to be forced to adopt a more hostile policy against Iran. Saudi Arabia now cannot play diplomatic game with Iran anymore. They are pushed now to be confronting them. Turkey as well now is reconsidering its policy, diplomatic policy with Iran. Before they were trailed, Turkey has even helped Iran to reach a deal in the Iranian nuclear deal. Now, Turkey is saying that Iran is too ambitious, and maybe they have to change this, zero problem diplomatic or foreign policy with Iran. That might also cause a nuclear arm race in the region. Now we're hearing a lot of reports about Saudis thinking of buying, of constructing their own nuclear reactors. Some I've read a year ago, Carnegie Center has also published about the Turkish ambitions in nuclear power. And of course, the last thing is that there is tensions also in oil markets, as we see, and this tension is translated today in a huge drop in prices, in oil prices, and something that is completely out of control. As for Turkey, what are the Turkey's priorities in Syria? Of course, you are better placed to answer this question than me, but let me answer this question from a Syrian point of view. Turkey wants to halt the refugee flow to Turkey. They want to stop. 2 million is already too much to be with. They want to lessen the humanitarian crisis in Syria, so people will stay in Syria, actually do not come to Turkey. To create safe areas for the opposition in the north, to accommodate the refugees and they turn in the place, and also for a place for the Syrian revolution to start, a new war campaign against the regime. They want definitely to weaken the PYD in Syria, and to create a buffer zone between them and ISIS, between Turkey and ISIS. They don't want common territory or frontier borders with ISIS anymore. This is especially after they declared war against ISIS. They need them out of the borders. And of course, the last point, this is a small mistake here, is to get rid of the Assad regime. They don't want the Assad regime. The Assad regime is a true menace, it's a true threat to the Turkish sovereignty, because Bashar al-Assad and his father before were always capable of staying in power by creating problems to their neighbors. They have, when in 1980s, when Hafez al-Assad was in a very tough situation, he decided to invade Lebanon. When in the 70s there was the Palestinian province, he invaded north of Jordan. So I don't say that Bashar al-Assad has enough power to invade Turkey, but he has enough malice to do problems in Turkey. We have seen, you remember the explosion that happened in Rehani 2 years ago. This was an explosion caused by security apparatus from the regime side. So Turkey needs, from a security point of view, to get rid of al-Assad. We are seeing also the emergence of a Saudi-Turkish axis. It's an emerging axis. It's not a solid one yet. They are still trying to find each other, the Saudis and the Turkeys. The problem that is stopping them from reaching such, a strong axis between them is that the Turkish government is asking the Saudis to adopt a clear strategy. And the Saudis, for the time being, are all over the place. They have confronting a very tough transitional period. The new king is still getting hold of powers. It's a very single, authoritarian regime. They don't have institutions, so all is in the hands of the king. The king is still busy. And even more importantly, this will be the last king from King Abdulaziz, the founder of Saudi Arabia, in lineage. The next king in Saudi Arabia will be a son, will be a grandson of the founder. So this is also making a lot of problems, because he still has, brothers who wanted actually to be king in Saudi Arabia. So they are also handling that. They have a lot of internal problems. They are engaged in Yemen in a very bloody war. So at the end, the Saudis are not capable of coming up with a strategy to which the Turkish actually can buy in. So the Turkish government is saying, we are dear friends, we value our friendship, but please come up with a strategy, or at least take our strategy, adopt our strategy, so we can work together. But at this point, it didn't happen so far as I know, of course. Saudi, as I told you, the same thing as in Turkey. They want to maintain security of their own country. They want to stop the Iranian expansion, and they want to end Assad rule, but not the regime. This is the difference between Turkey and Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia might be enough for it to kick Assad out of Syria. But for Turkey, it's not only that, they want to change the whole regime. And the difference between both of them is that Bashar al-Assad at the end is a figurehead. And the regime, if you change it, they can bring another one. But the regime will still work in the same way. What the Turkish government actually do not want to see in Syria is that the Egyptian scenario repeats itself, in which there is a revolution that is triumphal, that's a new elected president, such as Morsi, and then there's a Sisi who take over. So they don't want to see that in Syria happening. Now to Iran. Iran, of course, they want to control Damascus. They want to take control of strategic areas around Israel in order to, to manage and monopolize the management of the confrontation between the Muslim countries and Israel. This is very important for their security. And of course, they want to use Syria as a possible way to integrate themselves better in the international community, in order to say to the international community, we are here, we are very powerful, and you have to understand that we are the best people you can speak to this area. So speak to us, because we are capable of being the policemen of this area. This is what we've done in Iraq, and we are also looking to do in Syria. US in the Middle East want to avoid military confrontation and intervention in Syria at any cost. Obama is not at this place. They'd like to engage local partners in fighting terrorism, and this is why the Train and Equip program exists. They are really, they really want to use Tehran as a counterbalance to Turkey, to Saudi Arabia, this area. They do not want to have only, a single power in this area. They want to have both powers competing for homogeny over this area, and that both parties are looking for the acceptance of the United States. So what they are looking for this period, especially since the Saudis and the Turkish have shown over the last few years more resistance to the American, policy in this area, they want to empower Iran in order to create competition and to bring Turkey and Saudi Arabia back, to the friend zone. Let's say. As for Russia priorities, for them, Syria is the main area in which they can show that they are here and they are to compete with the United States. This is the last country to which they have access to warm water. They want to challenge the United States. They don't want it to fall under their control. This is how they see it, regardless of how true it is. And they are ready to be present in Syria in order to show this magnitude of the importance. And we've seen the last intervention in Syria. It was in this optic reason they wanted to get control. So what is the outcome? The outcome that you have now a multipolar international order. We don't have now Russia and United States only competing with each other. We are seeing the emergence of regional powers such as Iran and Turkey, who are now getting stronger and stronger on international level. They are not as strong, of course, of the United States and Russia, but they are gaining, momentum. And of course, all of this confirm the inability of the United Nations Security Council to do anything. This is a Security Council that is incapable of bringing peace as it should be and as it was created for. I'm not going to bore you more. This is just an explanation of how the political track has operated in Syria. Ms. Zainab had the presentation, so feel free to ask her for it.
Okay, so
I will end here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.